You assume that the Deadpool and Wolverine movie affected Deadpool's first appearance in New Mutants 98. But did it, though? Hey there, I have a fair market analysis video, and today we're going to look at New Mutants number 98, the first appearance of Deadpool. I finally saw Deadpool and Wolverine and I enjoyed it. It was very entertaining, but the whole time I was thinking, do I need to get his first appearance? Should I get it? It's not a book that I own. I was really curious about the values and also was curious about how the value of New Mutants 98 has really changed over time because of all of the significant events related to Deadpool and his live action appearances. What I decided to do was gather the history of verified sales of New Mutants 98 in a CGC 9.8 and also gather what I feel are significant events related to the character in live action so that I can really see if there are actual trends and determine if these live action events really impact the value of the book one way or another. Now, having recently experienced MCU movies and the speculation of character appearances, casting news, option news, or whatever, I think it's just always assumed that if there's something in live action or even animation or just something that has been brought to life off of the comic book page, that it positively affects the value, at least at some point. I think there's also the assumption that the book will eventually go down, like there's a right and a wrong place to invest or collect. And I would just rather look at the data and figure it out for myself. And that's what I did. I compiled this data. I want to share it with you. And I think before I show you the information that I've gathered, I took an educational guess. And certainly as I was interested in acquiring a New Mutants 98 in a CGC 9.8, I was curious to see what would it cost me, but also, is this a good time to invest and what is the history? But the educational guess that I had come up with, which is, I don't think, a surprise, is that it's probably at its peak right now, at the time that Deadpool and Wolverine is the most successful R-rated movie at the box office. I think they're well over $1 billion in revenue. And while some folks might critique the plot or have some issues with the final act of the movie or how it wrapped up, I think in general the assessment, it was a very entertaining and enjoyable movie. And while I prefer streaming, it actually got me out of the house and into the movie theater, so I think there's something to be said there. And that's where I was thinking, well, it must be the most valuable. And that's what got me thinking that New Mutants 98 and a CGC 9.8 must be at its most valuable right at this moment. And the release of the movie has significantly, positively impacted the value. But enough about me just talking about it. Let's look at the actual data itself. And this is the New Mutants 98 fair market analysis dashboard of a CGC 9.8 that I've put together. I did something similar to Amazing Fantasy 15, but have enhanced this a little bit since then, adding some date range selections. And also I wanted to visibly display some of the significant events so we can kind of go through them. So first and foremost, what we're looking at in the main chart of this dashboard is the history of recorded sales from September 29th, 2008 through August of 2024. And you can see the thicker orange trend line showing a positive increase in the value of this 9.8 over time, which I don't think is a big surprise. I think what was surprising when I first saw this was that the value in a 9.8 has gradually increased over time. There's not a lot of sales data where the value has been pushed significantly and then it is held. Now, just like with my analysis on Amazing Fantasy 15, there are other significant events that maybe were not related to that specific issue or character that I try to include to affect the grade. In general, you can kind of summarize this as the end of the Infinity Saga for the MCU, plus the pandemic era stimulus money and things like that. And I'm not exactly sure what we're going to call that era but you can just visibly see in this graph kind of the era that I'm talking about right in here, from the early 2020 through, I'd say, late 2021, early 2022, where this information now, but the value volatility is consistent. What's nice about New Mutants 98 and a CGC 9.8 is there is a lot of transaction data. You can see once we kind of get beyond 2013, everything is kind of a blob in terms of these data points. Whereas Amazing Fantasy 15, while it did have sales, it was really spacious in terms of looking at the data and the data curves and so forth. So there's a lot of information here. And just like Amazing Fantasy 15, what I want to do when we're looking at this information is take out 2021 and 2022 so that we can see a more normalized evaluation of the transactions. Because rather than trying to explain that era, it's almost better to kind of just pretend it didn't happen and try and figure out where the value of this book is headed for sure, but also to look into the past and see if any of these events moved the value of this book. So I'm going to exclude 2021 and you'll see the values disappear. And then I'm going to exclude 2022. And this is what the data points and the trend line looks like without those years. Now, it's still a nice, positive, and steady growth book. And we'll zoom in on some of these specific date ranges as we go forward if it's a little unclear or difficult to see from the graph. I wanted to give you kind of the high level overview of the trends and the data points and how the book has been affected over time by certain significant events. But all in all, it's a book that has steadily increased in value over time, at least over the last 15 to 16 years. Let's start to dive into some of the significant events to see if in a smaller sample size, those events affected the value of the book. The first thing is the introduction of Deadpool in live action, which occurred on May 1st, 2009 in X-Men Origins Wolverine. That's essentially Deadpool's first appearance in live action. Maybe not the most well-received appearance, as the Merc with a mouth appeared with his mouth missing. It was maybe not the way that Ryan Reynolds intended the character to be portrayed in live action. But what I had heard was there were already talks, even back in 2009, where Ryan Reynolds was attached to the Deadpool project. And in an interview, he stated that in order to really see the character and the project through whenever the movie was going to get made, he had to portray the character originally. So he was sort of forced into the role, but it was not the Deadpool that he brought to life for sure. A first appearance nonetheless, but maybe not the portrayal of a character that would really get you excited and make you want to go back into the comics or invest in Deadpool or Deadpool's first appearance here in New Mutants 98. But I think the first interesting time frame is the first appearance through where the test footage of Deadpool leaks, where it starts to generate some hype. Now, Deadpool wasn't released until 2 years after this, but this was the first moment. I remember it almost looked fake, or people were speculating, was that footage even real? Just didn't quite know what to make of it. And Ryan Reynolds himself has admitted that he may have helped with that footage being leaked, so to speak. So I want to plug in these dates into the date range. So I'm going to plug in that May 1st, 2009 date. That's when X-Men Origins Wolverine was released. And then all the way through, let's say, July 31st, because the footage leaked, but you wanted to give it at least maybe a couple of days to see if the hype around the footage translated into sales of New Mutants 98. So July 28th, 2014 was the date the footage came out. And let's choose July 31st and apply that and zoom in on some of the sales. Now, the first thing I will say is the recorded sales, they are what they are. This does not necessarily mean that there were no sales of the book or little sales between 2009 and, say, 2013. As a lot of the sales tracking mechanisms, it kind of depends, data availability, API. So this one's tough for me to really say, look, when the test footage dropped, that's specifically when sales picked up. I think this could just be data availability, so don't get the wrong impression here to say that something happened in 2013 and all of a sudden the book started selling. I think this is just when a lot of the data grabbing and the maturity of the transaction availability became more prominent and more known by the aggregators like Cover Price, Go Collect, GPA, and so forth. But the data is still showing a steady increase over time. And then, yes, around 2013 through that end of July 2014, a lot of sales, but I would say consistent sales. It was almost like there's some up and down, but just slight gradual increasing of value of the 9.8. And then we can use some of this data of the actual sales to dig in and see what some of the highs are in terms of the transaction. March 30th, 475, June 4th, 475, July 13th, 470 were the high sales for this time period. So I think what you're seeing is a high volume of transactions, the potential for this character starting to kind of warm up, but it's really not until the character appears with absolute certainty in live action, whether it's a trailer or the full feature length film. So I'm going to reset the date to today so we can look at some of the other significant events over time. And the next event that I wanted to look at was February 12th, 2016, when the Deadpool movie was released. There's a note in here about how it significantly boosted the value. Now, that's just, again, kind of the general idea. But I think this is kind of the time frame that we're looking at. If we look in right here, this is where I would say is probably the most significant value, where you see the trend line and a lot of the sales between 2012 and 2015, 2014, right in here. This is where everything's under the trend. Then all of a sudden, we have all of these transactions above. And this is that period of speculation where the Deadpool movie, it's rumored to being made, it's speculated on, trailers are coming out, and then finally around February 12th, which should be right around here, the movie is released. Now, what's interesting is the movie's released in 2016. Then we start to see this downturn of sales where it just goes right back down. So where it was starting to spike in mid to late 2014, it then returned to about the same value here in November of 2016. So a lot of hype, a lot of speculation. The movie is released, people love it, and then the movie comes and goes, and then people kind of forget, and the value of the book goes down. And the value is under the trend for the next several years, all the way through the end of 2020, where finally some consistent sales are above the trend line. Now, of course, Deadpool had a sequel around 2018, but again, there's not a lot of significant change. You could even argue that the sequel was maybe not as good as the original, and maybe that had an impact on this book, where sales became rather flat and stagnant, maybe dipped a little bit, or just kept continuing down. And then something happened around 2019 where we can start to see the book going up in value rather significantly, maybe not as vertical as it did in 2014, but around this time, value started to pick up again. And that's because on March 20th, 2019, Disney acquired the rights to 20th Century Fox, which brought all of those licensed properties back to Marvel. So the speculation was, not only are Disney getting the X-Men and Fantastic Four back, they're also getting Deadpool back. So this is right around here. This is that 2019 period. I think it took a little while before that started to pick up steam. Like, wait, is there going to be a possibility of a Deadpool 3? And once it was sort of confirmed, yes, that is definitely a possibility, then all of the speculation started to pick up again. Specifically, December 10th, 2020 is exactly when there was confirmation of that. Now, we were already seeing some of the values go up before that confirmation. So this was all like driven by speculation. This was also just on the edge of the pandemic and stimulus checks and a lot of the other ways that folks at home were starting to invest and look at things. So that's where some of this becomes a little convoluted. And obviously, because we're excluding 2021 and 2022, the information disappears. Now, I'm going to put 2022 back in just for a moment, and I want to zoom in a little bit on some of this data, because I think there was an event that really did kind of nearly break the internet, and that is on September 27th, 2022, Ryan Reynolds released the video where he had asked Hugh Jackman to reprise the role of Wolverine in Deadpool 3. So I want to plug in that date of September 27th, 2022, and we'll just leave to date in there so that we can see a little bit more zoomed in information. And this is where the graph gets a little interesting, because it's obviously the first thing that you'll notice, not a positive trend line. But on that date, that's when Ryan Reynolds asked Hugh Jackman to return as Wolverine. And again, you're thinking, okay, absolute hype. Nothing but hype at this point. The movie's going to be bonkers. Hugh Jackman's back. Deadpool is finally going to appear in the MCU, and off we go. So that didn't happen. Here is what is interesting. Right after the announcement, there were about 4 here that kind of spiked. Sale price of $2,000. Here's one, $2,025, well above the average $1,400 for this time period. There's another one, $1,796.50. So definitely some folks timed that right if they were going to sell this book. Just a couple of weeks after the announcement, it was still selling very, very well, and excluding 2021, probably in maybe the top 10 or 12 highest sales of the book came right after that video. Now, the last couple of points I'll make on this are, again, like maybe things that we have gotten used to or accustomed to in terms of comic books and speculation and value, and that is a movie trailer and then the actual release of the movie. The trailer for Deadpool 3 was released February 11th, 2024 during the Super Bowl. So you really can't get a bigger event than that to act as a vehicle to show your trailer of what was arguably one of the most anticipated MCU movies over the last couple of years. Essentially, if you think about it, September 27th was kind of like an absolute preview teaser, and then February 11th was the proper trailer. And this was right around here, February 11th, and you can see actually the sales dropped. The values were below the trend. Sale price of $11.10, $11.25 around this time period, and really didn't pick back up for another month, where we had several sales above the average, $13.25, $1,500, then back above the average, $15.85, and so forth. And if we zoom in there and change the range to match the trailer released February 11th, 2024, we can see that it's close to flatlining, definitely dipping a little bit. And this is really from the trailer to the release of the movie on July 26, 2024, and thereafter. There's one sale here, a sale of $2,200 on July 9th. That was about 2.5 weeks before the movie came out. Really an anomaly. I thought about taking this data point out, but it's still there. I don't think it affects the values all that much. It affects the average, but in terms of the trend, just pretty much everything kind of hovering around this $1,400 average. And then since the movie was released on July 26th, most of the sales have been at the trend or just below, which is pulling the trend down beneath the average sale price. Now, if you could just reflect for a moment, like, what does all of this mean, or what does this mean for value? Like, if you're thinking about it, this is a character that has had a trilogy of movies, has had a lot of hype. I would argue to say one of the better casting choices, Ryan Reynolds being cast as Deadpool, but also having an influence and a say in the writing and the way that the character appears on screen, how he behaves, what he says, and then to bring in one of the other best bits of casting, Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, and put them in the same movie. of all the MCU movies, you can't almost get bigger than that unless you're comparing it to something of the Infinity Saga nature. But in terms of like a standalone film or pair or set of films, or however you want to look at it, if you love this character, it's been portrayed and available and displayed at arguably the highest quality, the most popular, like non-comic book fans are going to see Deadpool and Wolverine to go out to the cinema and have a good time. And we're staring at this graph. We're staring at something where the value is going down. Now, this is where I'm conflicted because over the last 6 months, the value has steadily gone down. But since 2009, when Deadpool was transformed into this popular 90s character that meandered his way through different comic book series and also an evolution of his character all the way to live action, through that experience over time, over a 15, 16-year period, the value has steadily gone up. But over the last 6 months, it has steadily decreased when at this time, this is when everybody was excited about the movie and looking forward to it and speculating it. You had a number of commercials and teasers and character cameos were being rumored, etc. You would think that this would have more of a positive impact on Deadpool's first appearance, but recently it has not. And I'm just going to return the graph kind of where it was so we can take a look one last time between May 1st, 2009 to date. So we can see some positivity here and look at the data. Now, the original hypothesis of Deadpool and Wolverine, Deadpool 3 specifically having an impact on the book, I don't think it's had a significant impact, positive or negative. I think that what originally impacted the value was that first idea, that first moment where the character is seen in live action. I think that that's where the initial hype really is, the excitement, the speculation of it. But I think over time, while the movies can be enjoyable, the way that the movies influence the comic books, it's not as impactful as we think, especially on a book like this. There are some other factors to consider here too, where New Mutants 98 is a comic book that is easy to find. There are, as you could see from the data that I shared, a number of transactions, well over 1,000 copies of New Mutants 98 in a CGC 9.8 in the census. And this was only for the direct edition too, by the way. So this was even a subset of the greater sales of a 9.8. This doesn't include signature series. This was just a blue label CGC 9.8 analysis. My takeaways was certainly, I'm not necessarily buying at the peak, but if I'm looking at the average price, I'm looking at the trends over the last 6 months or 12 months, I think what I would do, especially if I was participating in it like a heritage auction, I would set my bid cap at a certain amount. I would not be influenced or make an assumption that I need to pay more for this book because Deadpool 3 came out. In fact, you should be able to pay less. Now, less than the book was selling for in 2014 or 2015? Of course not. And I think that that's the other interesting part to me is I don't necessarily consider New Mutants 98 to be like a blue chip book necessarily, or a book that I can really count on to hold value over time, like maybe a Silver Age Marvel Key would fall in, or a Golden Age book or something like that, that has more proven growth over time. But I think that maybe you could make the case for New Mutants 98 being in that category, especially if you're looking at this data over 15 years. Now, the interesting thing is Deadpool has come and gone in the MCU. I don't believe we'll see a Deadpool 4. I could be wrong, but I think there's a nice 3-movie arc for this character. He's in live action. Maybe some future cameos is probably what we'll end up seeing. So it will be interesting to see if we kind of advance 15 years from now, what does that trend line look like? I think it might be similar to what we've seen with some steady growth, but probably even less growth, or could just kind of flatline at whatever that average was. Over the last 6 months, I still think it's a good book to have and invest in, but it could end up being a book that what you pay for it today might not be worth that much more, maybe, a couple points, 5% of a gain on your investment over, the course of a few years, 5 years, let's say. So I wouldn't expect major gains on this book at this point, but I wouldn't expect major losses either, just because I believe that we're a wrap on Deadpool in the MCU. Doesn't mean you can't go back and enjoy those films, collect this book. What I would do is set your target price just under where it is trending at this point, and really not stress about it going up. If you were, participating in an auction at a certain price and missed out, I would just wait a week or two, try again, and you'd probably be able to get it at your price or maybe a little bit less. As always, I'm not a financial advisor. This is all for entertainment. And I really enjoy going through these numbers and putting this together just to kind of see, because again, I'm just assuming, hey, I like the movie, the book's got to be valuable or more valuable today than it ever has been. And that's not always the case, and really glad that I had the data to prove it out. Let me know what you think about this analysis, some of the other potential impacts to the value of New Mutants 98. Would love to get your feedback. Thanks for watching, happy collecting, and see you next time.